Now, transitioning from the Ming Dynasty to the Qing Dynasty. These first contacts with the West, by the time that the Portuguese were sailing into China for the first time, China was already a very large empire and a very ancient civilization. In fact, the Europeans were regarded as, quote, younger brothers. The ruler of China called himself the Son of Heaven, pointing back to an ancient philosophy that the gods had chosen their ruler, and that to maintain this status as a son of heaven, this divine mandate, the ruler must be good, and that this goodness of the ruler is required for maintaining power, that a ruler can actually lose the mandate of heaven. But anyway, Europeans at first were not even allowed to trade with China and were seen as unwelcome guests. However, as you can imagine, the arrival of Europeans had a transformational impact on Chinese society. Europeans became involved in regional trade. The Spanish got involved in the trade too, and eventually acquired the Philippines as a base and a colony, which they would hold until 1898, when that would be taken by the United States. However, more influential than trade, perhaps, was the introduction of Christianity to China. And this was accomplished mainly by the Jesuits. They were a Catholic order of priests sent around the world to attempt to convert as many people as possible to Christianity. And they were very effective at this. They excelled at learning the culture and the language and adapting their message to fit the culture that they were speaking to. And they were able to make many connections between Christianity and Confucianism, the dominant philosophy in China at that time. A number of European inventions helped the Europeans gain influence, largely with technology related to sea travel and trade. And also the missionaries returned, in many cases, to Europe, bringing examples of Chinese culture back to Western Europe. The virtues of Confucianism were very popular among European political thinkers. But now, when the Portuguese began to arrive, the Ming had already reached their peak. In fact, they were on the decline due to a series of weak rulers, corruption, extravagant spending, and high taxes, which led often to peasant rebellions. Because of these high taxes, which contributed to inflation, there was quite a bit of dissent in the Ming Empire and dynasty at the arrival of the Portuguese. There's also a great deal of threat externally. The Mings found themselves making alliances and trading privileges with foreign tribes to keep them away. In fact, we found the same to be true of the Romans shortly before their collapse. They were often paying off the Visigoths, bribing them, etc., to keep them at bay. And the neighbors to the north of the Mings were the Manchus, modern-day Manchuria. Because of an epidemic which devastated their population, because of widespread suffering among the Manchus, they went on to occupy Beijing. So they wound up kind of being pushed out of their home and going on to occupy what is today the capital of China. In fact, the last Ming emperor committed suicide by hanging himself from a tree in the palace gardens. Now, when the Ming dynasty was overthrown, this presented a great temptation to the Manchus. There were a number of military commanders that had deserted the Ming who went on to conquer Beijing on their own. Eventually, the Manchus declared a new dynasty, and these are the Qing dynasty. But at this time, we can consider China under foreign rule. I wanted to show you this picture to illustrate just the extravagance of China, the power of China, the wealth of them at this time. What we're looking at here is from one of the Chinese fleets sent to explore the world and give gifts. The Admiral Zhang He was sent around the world on a mission of diplomacy to make contact with as many nations as possible and spread the influence of China. So this was his flagship. This was the ship Columbus discovered America in. So just a little bit of contrast in size. Now, Qing Shi was arguably the greatest ruler in Chinese history. His rule began at age 7. And while under the influence of advisors at that time, early on in his rule, he was known for managing to pacify resistance and maintain a high degree of popularity. So he was both loved and feared. One of the few rulers that could truly claim that within their lifetimes. He sought the support of scholars, surrounded himself with excellent advisors, and again was generally considered one of the greatest rulers in Chinese history. Under his reign, Western missionaries were welcome and did quite well, in fact. Jesuit missionaries were often sought after for counsel and advice. During his reign, 300,000 Chinese people converted to Christianity, which was seen as a welcome influence at that time under his rule. Jesuits were actually criticized by European Catholics for going too far in accommodating local customs into their beliefs, which led to the Pope ordering that all converts and missionaries had to adhere to Orthodox beliefs. It was so important to Qing Shi that Christianity and Confucianism meet in the middle, that he appealed directly to the Pope in response to this order. And the Pope actually denied Qing Shi the right to blend these two cultures together. And this led Qing Shi's successors, his children and those who came after him in power, to suppress Christianity. And so you could argue it was opportunity lost for the church to gain influence in China. Now, after Qing Shi came a ruler named Qi Long. Carried on this legacy of maintaining a strong military, uniting the country, coupled with a prosperous culture and economy. And under his influence, the Manchus continued to grow and to prosper. Although, like many empires, we begin to see signs of internal decay. Military campaigns, which grew in cost as they grew in length, became extremely expensive. And the emperor and his bureaucracy became corrupt with time in the Qing dynasty. Eventually, this corruption would lead to a great deal of civil unrest, causing later a peasant rebellion. A little about Qing politics, though, before we discuss its collapse. The Manchus were incredibly adaptable. In fact, they changed very little about the political system of the Ming Dynasty. They never attempted to change much about Chinese culture. They just adopted Confucianism, just like their predecessors. And these Confucian moral ideals, which had already been a part of Chinese culture for so long, were perpetuated as the moral values of the empire. Now, the Manchus are ethnically different from the rest of the Chinese population. In fact, they represent only 2% of the entire Chinese population. And the Manchu nobles, which were the ruling class of the time, did remain wealthy from their massive land holdings by being the conquerors and the taxations that they collected from their lands. Ethnic Chinese were not allowed to live in Manchuria and were required to wear their hair a certain way to distinguish themselves from the Manchus that were the ruling class at this time. Now, a little about how to climb the ranks in Chinese society. China under the Manchus had a system called a diarchy. And a diarchy means that administrative positions were shared equally by the Chinese and by the Manchus. Though the Manchus considered themselves the ruling class, in effect, the ethnic Chinese shared power equally. In fact, the Manchus were increasingly assimilating into Chinese civilization. Now, it was at this time, under the rule of the Manchus in the Qing dynasty, that China's population began to explode. In fact, China is very significant, and we will come back to it throughout this course, because it is the largest country in the world. And it underwent this population explosion around the time of the arrival of the Portuguese, around the time of the Manchu dynasty, for several reasons. In fact, the population at this time went from around 100 million, maybe 50 million, to over 300 million within a short span. And there's several reasons for this. Number one, there were new crops coming in from the Americas that grew extremely well in China. For example, we have on the coast of Carolina what are called tidewater crops, tidewater farms. These farms are at such a low elevation that tide does affect them. There's often standing water in these farms, and there are certain crops that thrive in standing water. Rice and tobacco and sugar cane are among these crops that do extremely well with standing water. In fact, rice is often grown in paddies with standing water. Now, tomatoes rot, standing water. Corn rots, no good. It doesn't grow in that type of condition. But rice, staple food of China, thrives in that. Again, these new foods, as part of the Columbian exchange, are thriving, leading to an abundance of food, leading to, yes, a rapid population increase, which does put more pressure on food production. And it does raise the question, how many people can China hold? They have over 1 billion people in population. And so while we're asking that question today, leaders in China at this time were certainly asking that question. And the question was, at what point would China's population reach what we call critical mass, in which there will be famine and widespread poverty and starvation? China was also undergoing a period of industrialization, growth in manufacturing and commerce. In fact, merchants and manufacturers expand to a global market. The silk trade, which was ancient and goes back for centuries in China, but among this, wood products, porcelain, cotton, cash crops like cotton, tobacco, rice, etc., were developing rapidly. And this is really China's industrial revolution at this time. But it does have some distinct differences from the Industrial Revolution in Europe. Number one, China's nobles still had to submit directly to the emperor. The state still controlled absolutely manufacturing and trade. And generally there were higher taxes on manufacturing than there was agriculture. And that just goes back from centuries of tradition. Europe was generally more advanced technologically, had several inventions and developments that China did not have at the time of the meeting of the two cultures. For example, the clock. The clock was more reliable than the one that the Chinese had been using and was considered a novelty in the court. It remained a novelty for quite some time, but China did not start producing their own clocks using this type of technology until much later. But now a little about daily life in Qing China. The old Confucian idea of filial piety, that is, loyalty first to one's family, was still central to Chinese society. In fact, large families were needed to keep farms at this time. We're still talking about a patriarchal society, meaning sons were favored over daughters. Sons were the ones expected to remain at home and work on the land. Marriages were arranged. In fact, often couples would not meet until the marriage itself. It would be brokered between families. And love was not viewed as a primary motive in marriage. In fact, it was often viewed as a distraction from family responsibilities. The father was expected to support his children and govern the family. The extended family, again, this is all under this idea of filial piety that we call Confucianism. But the extended family, called the clan, would have its own system of governance. Usually the oldest surviving member of that family was the de facto head. And they had their own system for providing for poor members of the family. And they often even had their own schools among their extended family. Women were viewed as inferior to men. In fact, women were, and a quote from your book here, and I quote, very secluded and virtuous, and it was a very rare thing for us to see a woman in the cities and large towns unless it was an older person. And that was just a quote from the time period. Women were more visible in rural areas where they could be frequently seen working in the fields. Now, historically, only males could aspire to a career in government or in academia. Wives were expected to be submissive and subordinate to their husbands. Legally, they could not divorce their husband, and they could not own property nor inherit property. Yet the husband could divorce his wife, even for something such as not producing male heirs. He was even allowed to take a second wife, or to have mistresses, and these were considered acceptable practices in their society. If a husband passed before the wife, the widow would often be expected to marry the husband's nearest male relative. And these cultural phenomena were not unique to China. In fact, this is very common in American society around the early Americas, early colonial Americas, etc. Female children were considered less desirable. Often they were not entitled to an education, and sometimes daughters would even be put to death. So again, very, very misogynistic, meaning preferring men in society. Yet it was often women who were in charge of educating the children, and often women who handled family finances. Some women could gain access to an education. In fact, wealthy women were often educated. And we do have some prominent works of art and literature produced by women from this time period in China. Now, in regards to cultural developments, this is also the time where we see a new form of literature, and that's the Chinese novel. Though these novels were considered, quote, less respectable, they were actually much more popular than the higher culture poetry. They often focused on issues relevant to commoners. Some passages contained sexually explicit material, and there was a great deal of erotic literature that was circulated at the time. There are many popular Chinese novels from the time period. Perhaps one of the most popular was The Dream of the Red Chamber. It's a story of tragic love between two young people caught up in the disintegration of a powerful Chinese clan. So it's, if you will, the Chinese version of Romeo and Juliet. But a little about Chinese art. Chinese art is impressive, if for nothing else, its technical perfection and the breathtaking quantity of art that came out of China from this time. The most impressive work of architecture was the Imperial City in Beijing, which was built on the ancient palace remains. And the basic design of this building has not changed since the Ming Dynasty. If you ever get to go tour the Imperial City, it has very high walls. It has a maze of private apartments and offices. And it has a number of stately halls for these imperial audiences. It was nicknamed the Imperial City. Now, at the time of the Ming Dynasty, the silk production reached its zenith, the height of silk production. And some of the very highest quality silks in all the world were created during the Ming Dynasty's rule in China. Now, under the Qing Dynasty, artists produced great quantities of paintings, mostly for purchase in the home. And so now we're going to transition to talking about Japan, and Tokugawa Japan to be exact. The three great unifiers are Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. It were these three individuals that helped turn Japan from a collection of warring feudal states into a nation. In fact, in 1568, Oda Nobunaga, who is the son of a samurai and the son of a military commander under the Ashikaga shogunate, seized the imperial capital of Kyoto and placed the reigning shogun under his domination. Over the next few years, Nobunaga attempted to consolidate his rule throughout the Central Plains, went on to defeat his rivals and suppress the power of the Buddhist estates, but eventually he was killed by one of his own generals. He was succeeded by Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and he was the son of a farmer. He worked his way up through the ranks to become a commander in the military. Hideyoshi located his capital upon taking control of Japan at Osaka, and he built a castle there to accommodate his headquarters and gradually extended his power to the southern islands of Shikoku and Kyushu. In fact, by 1590, he had persuaded most of the daimyo on the Japanese islands to accept his authority and had even, by the end of his reign, created a national currency. Despite their efforts, however, neither of these two were able to eliminate the power of the local daimyo. In fact, both were compelled to form alliances with some daimyo or other to destroy more powerful rulers. So daimyos were effectively feudal lords who ruled over particular parts of Japan. In order for these three unifiers to even hope to unify Japan into some type of nation, they had to knock down the power of these local lords, because these lords had been fighting one another for centuries. And perhaps most successful of all, when Hideyoshi died in 1598, Tokugawa Ieyasu, one of the most powerful daimyos in all of Japan, the daimyo of Edo, filled the vacuum. You see, Hideyoshi nor Nobunaga had claimed the title of shogun, but Ieyasu named himself shogun. This is a military term. In 1603, this initiated the most powerful and long-lasting of all the Japanese shogunates. Now, these Tokugawa rulers who followed in his stead managed to complete the restoration of central authority, which had begun with Nobunaga, continued with Hideyoshi, and completed with Ieyasu. But they called themselves the Tokugawa shogunate after this man who had managed to unify Japan. Now, a little about Tokugawa and his successors. Toyotomi Hideyoshi prohibited the practice of Christianity because he believed it interfered with Japanese cultural traditions. He cited Japanese heritage and the fact that Christians had destroyed, or he claimed Christians had destroyed, several local shrines. In fact, the Jesuit missionaries were ordered to leave Japan and not return. Merchants were permitted to continue, however. In fact, if you've ever read or seen the movie Gulliver's Travels, a quote from the book here. After reaching Japan, Gulliver asked the emperor to, quote, excuse my performing the ceremony imposed upon my countrymen of trampling upon the crucifix, which the emperor does. In fact, in Gulliver's Travels, if you ever read the book, the only real island he visits that's a real place was Japan. And what he's speaking about is the Japanese emperors refused to allow Europeans to come to the mainland unless they would trample upon a cross. And Christian business people would refuse to do that, and so they would be banned for trade. The Dutch, however, had no problem with this practice. They would stamp on the cross, and then they would do their business. The Jesuits protested being ordered to leave the island. Eventually, Hideyoshi would relax this policy and allow them to continue as long as they were discreet. So gone were the days of open conversion to Christianity, etc. The Spanish Franciscans were a little more aggressive in their approaches to evangelism. In fact, 9 Franciscan missionaries were executed, as well as a number of their converts, simply because of the fact that they refused to discreetly practice their religion. By 1612, all Christian missionaries had been kicked out of Japan, and Japan generally closed off access to any Western influence, except for the Dutch, because they didn't care about spreading religion. They only wanted to conduct business. Meanwhile, this is also under the reign of the Tokugawa shoguns. This is known as the, quote, Great Peace. Tokugawa attempted to strengthen the Japanese system. There's one term worth knowing here, bokufu. There's a phonetic spelling in your book, also known as bakufu. And what this is a collection of daimyos, or collection of these local lords. Under the reign of the Tokugawa shogunate, he did not eliminate the power of these landholders. He invited them to become advisors and a council of elders. And so instead of warring with one another, the elders were sitting down to discuss matters peacefully. And it actually allowed for a greater centralization of power. Now, the shogunate government set as its national policy that the shogun would govern directly 1/4 of the nation, and the rest would be ruled by these daimyos. And so the state, aside from that 1/4 of the nation, was divided into territories. The daimyos acted effectively as feudal lords, collecting taxes, ruling these lands independently, and then they would have to share a portion of the taxes with the emperor. The daimyos remained loyal because their families were actually invited to live and reside at Edo, where the capital was. So they got to live in this beautiful palace, but they were invited to live there so that the shogun could maintain control on them. And the samurai. And I'm sure you've heard a lot of the samurai, the legends, the stories, the movies. By the time of the unification of Japan, the samurai were becoming smaller as a class of people. They were encouraged to settle down and farm, and during this time, the importance of the samurai began to diminish. They still wore their swords, but it was often just for ceremonial purposes. Okay, so a little about life in the village, as far as ordinary lives of Japanese people. The central government, once Ieyasu took control, became more prominent and more involved in local people's lives. Confucianism was practiced and accepted as part of the general culture and practice of Japan. Bukufu decreed instructions for all aspects of peasants' lives. Family, like in China, was the basic unit of society. Peasants had very few legal rights. Most passed away without even any property to hand down. Many lived on feudal estates or worked as servants. Many more families worked cooperatively as farmers. But there's another policy you need to understand called primogeniture. And this meant that property was passed on to the eldest son. Now, younger sons could often receive land as inheritance too, but generally the property of the home or the estate was passed down to the oldest son. The role of women, similar to Chinese society, women were more restricted in their daily life, especially among the samurai. Among wealthy Japanese people, there was a degree, or at least a greater degree, of gender equality. Both men and women would work in fields and peasant families. Poor families, however, often put infant daughters to death or sold them into slavery. Like in Chinese society under the Qing, women were just looked down upon. Marriage customs are similar to China. The males were the heads of households. Women were not allowed to disobey their husbands. In fact, there was a death penalty. Husbands were within their rights to kill their wives for reasons of their determining. Promiscuous males were tolerated, while women were expected to be faithful to their husbands. Marriages were arranged, like in China, and if a wife displeased her husband, he could dismiss her, yet she could not do the same. For women, educational opportunities were limited, often to instruction about domestic duties, and for some, reading would be allowed. Yet for poor families, access to books was not generally available at this time. Wealthy women were able to gain more access to education, and there were some coeducational schools in villages or market towns. But as far as social classes in Japanese society, you have warriors, you have artisans or skilled workers, you have peasants, which were most people, and merchants or business people. And these classes are not just an occupation that someone would choose. These are things that people would be born into. In fact, intermarriage between these classes was forbidden. Outside of this class system are the Aitu, which are outcasts, those living outside of the class system, and their place of residence, where they were allowed to live even, was strictly regulated. Now, a little about Tokugawa culture. As far as literature, one prominent author who lived in the mid-1600s wrote several scandalous works. Perhaps his most famous was Five Women Who Loved Love. Was a piece of provocative literature at the time, and your book provides a quote from this, and so I'm going to read the quote. It says, "Men take their misfortunes to heart and keep them there. A gambler does not talk about his losses. The frequenter of brothels who finds his favorite engaged by another pretends to be just as well off without her. The professional street brawler is quiet about the fights he has lost, and a merchant who speculates on goods will conceal the losses he may suffer. All act as one who step on dog dung in the dark." And so as you can see, it deals with some kind of basely topics. This would not be considered high literature. This is popular literature. This is pop fiction. Very popular for the time. One interesting thing about these works of literature is it does challenge the concept of loyalty to family. As more people in China were gaining access to written works and gaining access to learning of literacy, this now literate mercantile class was eager for books that were just for entertainment, not classical works, not edifying pieces that make you a better person, just for good entertainment. And so as more people began to read, as reading was more accessible to the masses, that's what was in demand. And so we see, if you're watching the clip, some interesting pieces of popular culture, such as theater. This is called kabuki. And, this one here would have been accompanied by music, but I turned the sound off. Sometimes these can emphasize violence. Sometimes, in fact, even the government would impose regulations on this style of theater. Kabuki was originally performed by prostitutes. Now, the government stopped this, and the men would perform dressed as women. I don't know if you've ever seen Monty Python, but they did the same thing. It's a British comedy. Japanese poetry, meanwhile, remained traditional. One of the most popular poems of the time, or poets, was Baisho, writing in the traditional haiku style. Your book quotes a couple of his. Now, as far as Tokugawa art, the shogun ordered that all daimyo and their families lived in Edo, like I said, and each wealthy family would compete to see who could build the most extravagant, fancy mansion in the capital city. These shoguns built elaborate palaces filled with Japanese art. And so, again, much of this still exists today. Your book featured these two really interesting paintings that I wanted to show you. You see, the Japanese had a passion for Dutch learning. Not only the goods they could buy from the Dutch, but also the aspects of Dutch culture. So not only firearms, but also art. So if you look at these two works, and they're in your book, you can look at them later, you'll find a lot of similarities. So here's an example of Japanese ceramics, which were in high demand in Europe as well. This was from the Qing period. So now we're looking at perhaps the most famous of all Japanese art of the Tokugawa period. This is called a woodblock print, and it's titled The Great Wave off Kanagawa. And so this would be an example of genre painting. Some of these are of crowded city blocks. You'll see some that are decorated home interiors. This one is titled A Scene of Illustrated Scroll, and this is from the Tale of Genji. Now this one here, your book has actually kind of cut it or cropped the image because it's an erotic painting. This woman was drying herself after a bath, and it's titled Woman Wiping Sweat. Okay, now moving on to Korea and Vietnam. In Korea, the Yi dynasty patterned itself off of the Chinese, very similar culturally. They maintained close political and cultural relations with the Ming dynasty. They were considered a tributary to China, meaning a part of the Chinese empire that would pay taxes and submit to the governance of China. The capital of Korea was Seoul, and still is the capital of, well, part of Korea. Similar to China, to advance yourself in China, even the poor could hope to move up the social ladder. In fact, civil service examinations were open to anyone who could prove their competency. So this goes back to this ancient Chinese system called Confucianism, that you could prove that you were able to do a job by passing an exam. Of course, the only catch is these exams were rather difficult, and you had to go through an entire lifetime and career of education to be successful, to hope to do well on one of these exams. And so usually these jobs would be limited to those who could afford that type of education. Now, as far as commoners, there were peasants in Korea, and they worked as serfs on manors, just like Western European culture. There were slaves in Korea. They were called the Chon men, and they were considered, quote, beneath the dignity of other groups in the population. Korea went on to win its independence, had their own developed written language by the 1600s. But as economic changes began to develop, such as a rising agricultural production, which led to an increase in their population, we begin to see an industrial revolution in Korea, and also the domination of a more middle class. This old system began to degrade, this caste system of nobles, artisans, peasants began to degrade, which would allow people more social mobility. Because of the Koreans developing differently culturally, historically, ethnically, they were often harassed by the Manchus, the ruling power in China. In fact, the main threat in Korea in the 1580s was from Japan. For example, when the Korean king Sojo refused the Japanese shogun's offer of an alliance during a civil war, he launched an invasion of Korea. And the Japanese went on to conquer most of Korea. Now, the Koreans were eventually able to defeat the Japanese, asserting their independence, but then they had to deal from other external threats from China, and the Manchus actually came in to conquer Korea and force them to swear loyalty. So throughout much of Korea's history, they have been fighting to maintain their independence because of their close proximity to these two other ancient powers, Japan and China. Largely, they were unaffected by European colonialism, though there were some small Catholic communities. These Jesuit missionaries went everywhere they could. Now on to Vietnam. The Vietnam Empire during the 1600s was called Da Viet. It was not really involved in the European spice trade. In fact, they never really lost any territory to the Europeans at this time. Indochina would go on throughout the 1700s to become a French colony, but we'll talk about that later. They built an empire of their own on the Indochinese peninsula. So they did have a degree of independence. And as they expanded, like so many places, they became larger than their ability to unify. And so we begin to see many splinters off from the Da Viets. In fact, throughout the 1600s, there was a civil war which divided Vietnam into two countries. And later, as Western powers were trying to colonize this area, they would play these two different factions off of each other. This, in fact, continued even into the 20th century. And so you could argue that the American involvement in the Vietnam War was only a very small part of a centuries-long feud between two different factions in Vietnam. Now, the country finally reunited in 1802 with the help of the French, which would conquer and colonize Vietnam. And this unity lasted until the end of the Second World War, when North Vietnam surrendered to the Soviets and South Vietnam surrendered to the United States and France, and then here we have the problem again. By this time, Vietnam was called Vietnam. And